There's 84 dead, a number of others that are hanging on for dear life because of this individual that drove his truck. His name is Mohammed. No surprise there, I guess. And drove it through the crowds on Bastille Day. And we've been watching some of the debate that's taking place. So, Debbie, start us off. How should we think about this whole issue?
It's been interesting watching the world's reaction to this event, and particularly in America with our presidential elections coming up, because many of the networks right away asked for a statement from Hillary Clinton, the presumptive Democrat nominee, and Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee. And they were very contrasting responses. Donald Trump essentially said, "This is war." And he was asked whether he would agree with a comment by one of the Fox News commentators, who said basically we need to call it what it is. We're in a war and we've got to declare war. And, we haven't declared war in a long time in our country, an actual formal congressional declaration of war. But that's what is being talked about. And Donald Trump said, yes, I would support that, as did Senator Dan Coats from Indiana. This morning, the media said, yes, we have to just deal with the reality it's a war. Hillary Clinton was a little more measured in her reply. She said, well, yes, it's a war, but she had a lot of terms that were we have to be cautious, we have to be steady, we have to be wise, we can't overreact. And to me, it's a great opportunity for the Republicans to say, we've been following this Obama, Clinton, cautious, hold back, don't do too much in response to radical Islam in the last 7 years, and it hasn't gotten us anywhere.
Yeah. Chelsey, any thoughts about whether or not we should declare war or what we should do to fight the war on terror?
Well, I was absolutely relieved to see Trump's response, because he's been labeled a bit of an isolationist. They've said we don't know much about his stance on certain foreign policies, but from the statements he's made, it's been questionable as to whether he would, lean in when our allies are clearly under attack, and there are systemic international threats to our allies and ourselves, frankly. And so the fact that he did lean in and did acknowledge that this is something that cannot continue to be ignored, I thought was really, really important.
On the campaign trail, he said that NATO really is not doing any good work. And then he said, but if they would get involved in terrorism, well, now they have a terrorist section. And so now he's talking about working with NATO, but making sure some pay their fair share. And when you think about one of the largest armies in the Middle East is Turkey, who have not been involved very much in any kind of fight, that I think, Debbie, is at least one avenue that he might pursue if he becomes president.
I think he would. I think he would try to do that. It's also an interesting thing. They weren't talking about against whom will you declare war, because you can say we're declaring war against ISIS, but that's really not big enough, or that's not wise. You have to identify the enemy in fuller and more clear terms. It's an odd circumstance we're in, because we can't choose a country like Germany or Japan or other countries historically, but it is against, you could choose a name, but you have to define it such as it's against radical Islam, it's against supporters of the caliphate, it's against supporters of Sharia law, something that says it's not just ISIS, because there are dozens, if not hundreds of groups around the world who would commit similar acts as happened last night in Nice, France, if they had the chance. And they're the ones we have to recognize. It's the ideology of Islam that is the problem, that is the source of this horrible threat we're all facing.
Again, both of you are lawyers, so you recognize that wordcraft is going to be important. And I've heard some people say, well, what do we declare war on? It was real easy in World War II, Imperial Japan, the Nazi regime, whatever it might be. But I still think we can come up with that. But I think the problem that I have, Chelsey, is that you, up until recently, couldn't even get Hillary Clinton to use the word radical Islam. I don't think we've ever gotten the president to say that yet, have we?
I still haven't heard it out of his mouth, an acknowledgement of what it in fact is. But this type of war is in a lot of ways unprecedented. Our enemy does not have a specific uniform they're wearing. They're not even always particularly organized or highly technical. And so we will need a president who is going to be doing the intelligence, getting people on the ground to fight this war in a new way.
And I think, again, look at the methods. We always to recognize that if you focus on the instruments of the terrorist, you're not going to be very effective either, because who would have thought that hiring a lorry, and then apparently from what I understand, of course, we've got posted one of these articles that goes into it in a little more detail, the police stopped him at one point and he just said, I'm carrying ice cream. So there was just no way for anybody to realize that this truck was a threat to all those people.
Yes, and there was a lot of commentary about the fact that this individual shooter this time in France, so far as they've been able to determine, is not officially connected with any terrorist organization. He's not a card-carrying member of ISIS or Hamas or any of them. And so it goes back to the notion that the problem, it is the motivation for these acts, and it is the teachings of Islam. It is embedded in the teachings in the Quran. It's embedded in teachings of in other holy scriptures for the Muslims, and in many universities around the world today, and world leaders and imams in countries around the world advocate for violence against infidels. And so this guy, if he never connected with any organization, still chose to act out of what he learned about Islam. And Newt Gingrich, we can't get into this hour, but Newt Gingrich had some pretty choice comments last night that got him in some kind of trouble today, but that says it's not just a person. It is an ideology that says we're allowed to pursue the caliphate. Maybe the caliphate is one term we can weave into the definition of against whom we are declaring war.
You know, one of the other people we've had on the program is Sebastian Gorka, and he's been saying, you know, maybe you don't want to get into the religious part about the caliphate or Sharia, but can you at least say this is an individual that supports the values of the United States, or in this case, the values of France? This man was born in Tunisia. I don't think he ever really assimilated, never became really a Frenchman, other than the fact he lived in France. And this is the question that, of course, Donald Trump has been raising right now, bringing all these people from Syria, and it's going to be a massive number of individuals over the next couple of years when we don't know where they're from, we don't know what are in their heads, and don't know what they believe. Those are some issues that we certainly need to address. So let's take a break, and that is one of the issues on the table. Perhaps you would like to join us as we talk about this battle on the war on Islam, but since we're sitting across from Chelsey, she's been in Iowa, and this is an issue we've been talking about. As a matter of fact, Penna Dexter's commentary that will air tomorrow is on that. My commentary airs next week, but we want to find out what's happened up there in that church in Iowa. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Is America great? Was America great? It looks like we'll be having a debate about those questions in the next few months. During the 4th of July weekend, many on the left used America was never great hashtag on social media. While most of us were celebrating this nation's founding, liberals and progressives were making long lists of America's sins. Of course, these critics have every right to do so. That's what the First Amendment is all about. And it is worth mentioning that many of the other countries in the world do not grant its citizens the privilege of doing so. Perhaps they should be a little more grateful that they could actually fill social media with every possible criticism of this country and not have to pay any consequences. The reason for this hashtag is fairly obvious. Donald Trump wants to make America great again. And there are many others who not only believe America was great in the past, but great today. Talk show host Michael Medved starts every program and ends every program with a statement that this is the greatest nation on God's green earth. Given the decline in America, people sometimes ask him if he thinks it is still the greatest nation. He always responds by asking them, can you think of a better nation? Fortune magazine used 75 criteria to look at a country's progress in areas such as entrepreneurship, cultural influence, business-friendly practices, and economic progress. They concluded that Germany was the best country, with the United States coming in fourth. The United States was first in power, but lower in a few other categories. Even if you accept the rating criteria used by Fortune, you can still say that America is one of the greatest countries in the world. Is America great? Was America ever great? There are lots of people who don't believe that it was. So let's have a debate about America's greatness that involves more than a hashtag of 140 characters. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Available now. Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Rated PG. miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It is our weekend edition. Debbie Georgatos, Chelsey Youman with us. And we wanted to, and by the way, if you want to talk about this war on terror, we'll get to those phone calls in just a minute. But so often we deal with a lot of topics. And normally we start the program off if Kelly Shackelford is here or somebody else talking about religious liberty. And last week, Chelsey, while you were actually in Iowa, Kelly was educating us about what happened, and that is you have the Iowa Civil Rights Commission brochure on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so it asks the question, does this law apply to churches? The answer comes back sometimes. That wasn't the answer I was looking for, especially when it starts saying, well, you know, if it's not related to a bona fide religious purpose, like it could be a church service open to the public, we're going, whoa, wait a minute. So you've been up there having a chance to talk with Pastor Gordon. Tell us the whole story, if you might.
Yes, it was a bit of a firestorm, as you can imagine, but this was an unprecedented move by a state government to apply wholesale public accommodation laws to churches and houses of worship. And if you notice, that is very church specific. They didn't necessarily go as far to say, well, people of all faiths, you know, it was very targeted, but it did two things essentially. First, we've all heard of the bathroom wars. It did say that churches have to open up their restrooms for use by transgender individuals, which obviously our client Cornerstone has sincerely held religious beliefs on human sexuality. And second, and this was almost more disturbing to us, was it essentially placed a gag order on churches. Part of the statute says that you cannot even speak indirectly or directly in a way about these issues that would make someone feel, and I quote, unwelcome. Yeah. And so the fact that this church has doctrines of faith written down makes them stand in violation of this statute in this brochure. And the results could be as extreme as the CRC opening a full investigation against the church and the pastor, mediation, pulling them into the court, and fining them and penalizing them like we saw with our bakers, the Kleins out of Oregon. So this is a really, really egregious constitutional violation.
Well, and that sounds to me like Pastor Kerry Gordon's one of those people that likes to draw a line in the sand. Is that right? Absolutely.
But it's because of him and our brave and courageous clients like him that we even are able to defend religious liberty. I think it's so much easier to say we'll be the lamb, we'll be the church is the lamb. But at some point you have to say, you know, the government may not come in and tell us how to operate and what to believe or even what to speak about our beliefs.
You know, Debbie Georgatos, one of the things I've said is that sometimes pastors haven't really understood the religious liberty issue because it's happening to someone else. And I actually titled my commentary, First the Bakers, Then the Pastors, because I was using Martin Niemöller's idea because I've said, you know, few pastors have really been able to or even stand up to defend bakers and photographers and florists. And so, like I said, you could say first they came for the bakers, then they came for the pastors. And all of a sudden the pastors go, wait a minute, you know, this is something that could affect us. Well, it's been affecting people in your congregation for some time. So I'm hoping that this might be a wake-up call.
I would certainly think it would be. First of all, just commend that pastor in the church in Iowa for being so assertive about their rights. And I do think there's been a sense in the Christian church, I've noticed over my lifetime, the Christian churches have kind of backtracked. They want to be accommodating. They don't want to be seen as confrontational or unaccepting or unloving. And so they have backtracked on some very important scriptural teachings in order to be inclusive. And this is, you know, and those churches, they could sit and think, well, you know, okay, so we're not going to condemn gender identity, dysphoria, all this, the current argument about that, because we want to be loving, but they essentially lose their connection with truth. They lose their connection with the scriptures, and they look at these churches standing up and say, why do you guys have to just defend? Why don't you just be quiet and go along? I love that this guy wouldn't be quiet and go along.
And that's a very good point, and I think one that, you know, maybe the public hasn't gotten to see. We've had the question, in order for the church to operate in accordance with its beliefs, would it have to close its door to the public? Would it have to quit serving the public, quit doing outreach programs with the public? And the answer would be yes. And we all know as people of faith that a major part of this church's ministry and Pastor Gordon's ministry is to be able to open their doors wide and welcome everyone. And if they have to choose between adhering to their beliefs and serving the public, that is an untenable choice.
Well, if you want to understand what this could look like in the future, just go over to Europe right now. And next week we have, of course, Dinesh D'Souza in studio on Thursday. But Monday we have in studio Jack Graham, and he's the pastor of Prestonwood Baptist Church, and last year was the chairman of the National Day of Prayer. But his youth group is over in Scotland right now, and they were just singing, and it has become a firestorm over there. If you haven't seen this, it's on WorldNet Daily. They're referring to these kids as Nazi, KKK, and all of the rest. It's become a big story over in Europe, and now WorldNet Daily's covered it as well. And the reason for it is whores. These kids believe in sexual purity. They go to a church that actually has a pregnancy center, and that's just, manipulating women's health. And most importantly, they actually do not believe that marriage should be for any two individuals. And it's caused an unbelievable firestorm, and it's really begun to be quite an issue for some of those poor kids just going over there singing. They're not preaching, they're just literally singing. And that's enough just simply because, as you point out, once you head down this road, like the Iowa Civil Rights Commission brochure, then anything that you say inside the church or outside the church becomes hate speech, right?
That's absolutely right. And we think, this was an unprecedented move by the state government, but we have seen these public accommodation laws almost spread like wildfire across our country. And so even though this is the first state to say this applies to churches for merely opening their doors to the public, it should be a wake-up call for evangelicals everywhere. But we did have a positive resolution within a matter of days. And I'll say at First Liberty Institute, I don't know that I've seen this quick of a retraction by any government official. They did agree to amend the brochure as we asked, and they did agree to say, we won't enforce this against churches. You guys can continue to operate as you please. And there's this very small exception to that rule. So we're hoping it's a victory.
If you go to our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to First Liberty, or you can just go to First Liberty directly, but this goes there, and then you got a little check mark that says win on there. And so, Chelsey, you and everybody at First Liberty deserve a lot of credit. Certainly Pastor Kerry Gordon does as well, but it shows the win and it gives the final story. So it is fun to not only talk about the problem, but it's even more enjoyable to talk about the solution. So thanks for being up there, and let's hope we don't have to hear about that again, right?
I hope so.
It's an interesting thing, this tying back to our subject of the first segment. Part of what is happening and why some lawmaker or brochure writer in Iowa would feel comfortable writing this is because there's been this gradual acceptance in American society that Christianity is it's a nice thing, and it's just as nice as all the other religions, and it's just as reasonable as atheism. And so it's all and it's dismissed, it's being denigrated slowly. Instead of being a kind of an identifying factor for who we are as a nation and who we are as individuals, as kind of a cultural window dressing thing. And so, it's just a nice thing, but it doesn't really matter. Your beliefs don't matter that much. And so this is where you get to in Iowa, where you say, well, we've all agreed now that transgenders have equal rights to everybody else, and marriage is for any two people. So these religious people, they couldn't mind that much if we just apply this to them. It's just a reflection of society's gradual diminishing of religion as have a unique place in people's hearts and in our culture.
It's funny because the other topics we're going to address today, for example, Mike Pence, remember, as the governor, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or the state version of that, was an issue of controversy for him. We're going to talk about the Democratic platform and the Republican platform, and boy, do you see a difference there. And as a matter of fact, they want to have a minority report for the Republican platform that's LGBT, so we'll get into that. So you can see how this issue of homosexuality runs through almost all the stories here. And back to what Chelsey said, if we don't pay attention to some of these, what seem at the time small issues, what's the difference of one church in Iowa, or maybe even a handful of churches in Iowa? But if you don't pay attention then, you pay a price later on, don't you?
Absolutely. Churches have historically, and even in the courts, been considered sacred ground. It is the single most protected religious entity that exists. So the fact that something like this, that the CRC could pass something like this and it go unnoticed for a period of time, is extremely shocking and should be disturbing.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we already have a number of phone calls online, so we'll just get to those immediately. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We've only put two issues on the table. One is certainly topic for 2 hours if we want to, and that is, again, the killing so far of 84 people on Bastille Day in Nice, France, and your thoughts about the war on terror and whether we should declare a war how we go about this, who would be the best candidate to address these issues, what should be the policy of the Secretary of Defense and Homeland Security. Those all certainly are relevant issues, but we always like to focus on a few of these religious liberty cases. In this case, it's a victory, and that's one of the things we like to talk about. Sometimes we fail to realize how if we are willing to stand up, we're victorious. And Kelly would be here right now reminding me that his win rate is more than 90%. So
right.
That is, again, one of those things that you won't hear in the mainstream press, but you do hear on Point of View. So let's take a break. If you'd like to know a little bit more about our two guests on the roundtable today, we're going to talk about some of the other resources that are available. Those are all available on our website, pointofview.net. And if you go to there right now, you'll see that we've posted Penna Dexter's commentary on Iowa churches, and that one is going to be in your inbox tomorrow. We'll come back and take your phone calls right after this.
Imagine it's January 2021. The president elected in 2016 has served 4 years. Tell me, what does the Supreme Court look like with maybe 2, 3, even 4 justices named by this next resident of the Oval Office? Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? Depending on the results in November, 4 years from now will look very different, and together we can influence those outcomes. We need each other. Together we are the Truth Team, and together we can honor Christ as we exercise our stewardship as believers and citizens. One way to make a difference is to visit pointofview.net and support the Truth Team, pointofview.net. Or give when you call 1-800-347-5151. The nation is so divided, we must be united. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
1-800-351-1212. It is Weekend Edition and an opportunity to talk about a number of stories. We've talked about the Iowa church and the Iowa churches in general because of that particular issue. We've also, of course, talked about the terror attack in France. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgatos and Chelsey Youman. And since one of you wants to talk about Iowa, let's talk about that first. We'll go to Arkansas, KCMH. Thomas, thank you for calling today.
Yes, sir, Mr. Anderson. Long-time listener, first-time caller. The deal in Iowa is, okay, these are man's laws. These are not God's laws. The New Testament is pretty clear about which one we ought to follow as Christians. Now, admittedly, we need to, obey the law as much as we can, but when it comes to an absolute choice between God's laws and man's laws, God said we should obey God rather than man.
Acts 5:29.
So obey God rather than man. If it means jail time, go bail your pastor out and keep having church.
Yep. Well, again, Acts 5:29, and again, in some circumstances around the world, Chelsey, that's the only option. Either you obey the government or you go to jail. The good news is we have civil libertarian organizations, we have religious liberty organizations and others, and that's why I really encourage people to support a group like First Liberty, because your demand letter changed everything, didn't it?
Yes, we didn't even have to go to court or go through litigation. We were able to just give them the chance to do the right thing. And in this scenario, they did. But, the caller sounds a lot like Pastor Gordon. He said, I do not have a choice. I'm in violation of your statute. And I think that's really telling.
And I'm not going to change.
Nope.
Yeah, they expect everybody to kind of capitulate. While we're talking religious liberty, because the rest of our calls are on terrorism, one of the things, Debbie, you reminded us of is a story that has to do with calligraphers. And this comes from our good friends at Alliance Defending Freedom. And these are two great organizations, First Liberty, Alliance Defending Freedom. I support both of them, so, a disclaimer is appropriate. I send money to both. But they actually recognized that, again, it was a little bit like the pastor. They hadn't been cited yet, but they decided to take some preemptive action. Explain, if you might.
They did. The organization or the private business in question are two women who actually met in Bible study and formed a group that do calligraphy, lovely calligraphy invitations for weddings and other events. And they settled in Phoenix and had their business rolling. And then they realized that a Phoenix, Arizona ordinance required them to, in the terms of the ordinance, not discriminate. They had to provide their calligraphy services for people who wanted to be part of a same-sex wedding in the same way as they would a traditional wedding. And so these women decided, rather than wait to be found in violation or to be in the middle of some ugly litigation by someone who came in and wanted their services, they went ahead and preemptively they engaged these services of Alliance Defending Freedom, and they filed it with their calling a pre-enforcement challenge on the women's behalf against the Phoenix ordinance, essentially saying the ordinance strips artists of their freedom to choose what to create and what to say in the marriage context. So it's a different tactic, and we were talking in the break about how they made a formal filing with the agency, and so I guess it's litigation. I'm not sure if it's a court filing or it's just with interagency right now. Interagency?
No, it would be litigation. So it's filed in a court of law as a preemptive action. Yeah.
So anyway, they have, rather than try to work it out with the Phoenix ordinance writers, they instead went ahead and filed. But I kind of like this idea. You don't have to wait until you're embroiled in a really tough controversy, like people have the bakers represented by First Liberty and many other wedding service providers have gotten expensive and oftentimes bad outcome litigation. So this is being preemptive. But what Chelsey, we were talking about in the break, it's really kind of cool that in Iowa, they didn't get to the litigation point. They did the preemptive pre-litigation strike, but it wasn't litigation. They allowed Iowa to have a chance to look at it.
Yeah, just a demand letter. And that was all it took.
Yep, the demand letter and some pressure on the CRC, and they quickly rectified their ways, but pre-enforcement actions are something the ACLU has done for years and years, because courts have held that you don't have to wait for your constitutional rights to be violated. If something is facially unconstitutional, you can challenge that. If in the case of these calligraphers, they would be in violation of the public accommodation statute, and it's a matter of time until it's enforced against them. So best of luck to them. We definitely have clients that have undergone the same type of situations. Instead of waiting for your clients, like our clients, the clients be penalized $135,000 for very similar instance, not
Yes.
serving cakes to same-sex weddings. We are seeing these types of cases pop up around the entire U.S.
So again, the article that is the first one there is about from First Liberty about the Iowa churches. The third article there is about the calligraphers. And it's interesting, Chelsey, because I found oftentimes working with Kelly, especially being here every Friday, that lots of times you'll send a demand letter and people go, oh, I did not know. It's lots of times principals, superintendents, and those kinds of things. But sometimes you send it and they just dig in their heels, the Coons cheerleaders and some of these others, and you just go, well, okay, at least it ferrets out which ones we want to take to court, because we're really trying to avoid any kind of litigation. We just assume that you just didn't know and we wanted to educate you. But then when you educate them and they dig in their heels, well, then the next step is obviously one of those expensive court cases. And that's one of the reasons why they need to support First Liberty, right?
That's absolutely right. We want them to do the right things, but as we all know, government officials don't always choose to do that.
Well, let's take some more phone calls. We'll head this time to Louisiana, KPAE. Ricky, what would you like to say? I think you wanted to talk about the killing there in France.
Yes, sir. I just want to, and I know those Democrats listen to your program just like they do everybody else's, see if you do anything, that's wrong or say anything that's not truthful. But this ought to really show how stupid gun control is. I'd much rather be shot by a 1 ounce piece of lead than run over by 4,000 tons of steel and be crushed to death. Your chance of surviving a gunshot's a lot. They took all of them out of here. They would use trucks and planes. 9/11, not a single bullet was fired, but 3,000 Americans were killed during 9/11, not a single bullet. And Timothy McVeigh, a truck load of fertilizer, killed 500 people. So if you take away guns, they will use even more destructive means. I'd rather them lab guns to shoot us instead of revert 2-ton trucks to run over people and crush them, or planes blow up, or even fertilizer to blow up buildings. That just shows you how stupid gun control. The reason why the Democrats want gun control is because they know you can't get close to them with a vehicle, and the only way you can take out politicians is with a gun, and they're afraid of America.
I don't know about that, but, the whole issue of gun control, it struck me this week. We had this memorial service, and the president came down and spoke, and the first couple of minutes was very comforting and conciliatory, and then it ended up being gun control again, that kids on the street can get a Glock easier than they can get a book or can get a computer. And I thought, really? Well, which neighborhood are you talking about? But any thoughts about that?
Yes, President Obama's speech, he did start out in very lovely terms. He mentioned each of the officers who lost their lives in the sniper shooting last week in Dallas during the Black Lives Matter protest. He did a lovely little tribute to each of them, but he did very quickly go off into politics. And he said that line, Kerby, you just said about it's easier for some kids to get a Glock than a computer. And I saw some funny postings on Facebook. So I went into Borders and I said, or Barnes and Noble, and asked, "Do you have any Glocks?" But anyway, on a serious note, it was really a very unfortunate thing to launch off on gun control. I also found it it was just inappropriate. He was honoring these 5 officers, and yet he raised the names of 2 other recent victims in police shootings and kind of analogized the cases, and they're not analogous. And it was just it was a little bit of an in-your-face thing. There were several points about his talk that just seemed it was too political, and it was wonderful they invited him to come, and I think a lot of what he had to say though kind of rubbed people is that he just used it as a political speech. A lot of comments about race and crime statistics, which you obviously can't refute when he's standing up there, but they were inappropriate, I thought.
I think so. Let me just mention, as we go to a break in just a minute, that you will hear Penna Dexter's commentary, which we always play at the quarter to the top of the hour, and that is the one on Iowa churches, so you'll have a chance to hear about that. But let's take another phone call real quickly, because we do have time to hear maybe from Susan in Georgia on WGNN. Susan, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes. Thank you for allowing me to hear me. My question is this. In 2 Chronicles 6:32 and 33, what had happened is I had prayed for a long time, God, what is your will about all these people coming into our country? Is it your will that they come or not? But I felt like he gave me an answer, and if I might take liberty real quick, it says, moreover, concerning a foreigner who is not of your people Israel, but have come from a far country, for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your stretched out arm, when they come and pray in this temple, and I'll stop there. But he says when these people come for his great name, the great name of the Lord, and these people are not coming here for this reason. they're bringing, all their religions, their spirits, their whatever, and trying to create a different nation for us. And how do we effectively fight what's happening? What do we do? I'm fighting it on my knees, most assuredly. But, what action do we take?
Sure. And we're going to take a break, and let me come back and give you a couple of thoughts here. One on maybe a little bit of a perspective on 2 Chronicles and some of the other passages that relate to immigration, but also where do we go and what could we suggest to the next president of the United States? We'll take a break and come back with those suggestions right after this.
The federal government and state and local governments across the nation have been busy lately, forcing upon businesses, schools, and public entities their version of non-discrimination, which includes affirmation of all sexual orientations and anyone's chosen gender identity. Amidst all the controversy about these sexual orientation and gender identity bathroom laws, we have taken one thing for granted. Churches are exempt from these laws and requirements and their associated legal penalties. But an unprecedented mandate surfaced in the state of Iowa, revealing that church exemption from these laws is not a given. The state's Civil Rights Commission published a brochure entitled Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, a Public Accommodations Provider's Guide to Iowa Law. The guide states that churches are considered places of public accommodation, so they would generally not be exempt. The stated policy extended problematic bathroom policies to churches. And worse, according to this brochure, the state was claiming some authority over what a church teaches, its doctrine, what is preached from the pulpit regarding sexuality. These are the Iowa Civil Rights Commission's stated requirements for public accommodations. Patrons and congregants must be allowed to use living facilities, locker rooms, and restrooms based on gender identity rather than sex assigned at birth. Pronouns used in addressing people must correspond to their gender identity. In addition, the definition of harassment is expanded. Speech that conveys hostility or causes someone to feel unwelcome is forbidden. This could be interpreted as restricting a church's ability to teach its religious beliefs about sexuality. Is such a blatant violation of the First Amendment really the state's intent? That question is actually answered in the brochure. There's a section titled, "Does this law apply to churches?" The answer? Sometimes. If a church's service, outreach, or activity is, quote, not related to a bona fide religious purpose, it would have to comply. Who decides whether an activity is religious enough? The state. Cornerstone World Outreach, a non-denominational Sioux City church, recognized that the church was in violation and with its mission of outreach to the public would never be able to comply. First Liberty Institute, representing Cornerstone, sent a demand letter to the Iowa Civil Rights Commission, asking that it retract this mandate. The commission responded by revising the document and clarifying that churches are exempt, that these requirements existed in the heartland of America, that the state of Iowa officially claimed the power to regulate church facilities and what they can teach about human sexuality, ought to send chills up the spines of pastors nationwide. First, they came for the florists and bakers who declined to participate in same-sex marriages. Then they came for other businesses attempting to operate within the owner's faith principles. Then they came for the schools. Now we must be very vigilant because they are coming for the churches. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Susan asked a very good question. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But Susan talked about, 2 Chronicles 6, verses 32 and 33. And you can look it up a little bit later if you'd like. But first of all, I would say that you got to be careful about applying some of the principles in the Old Testament to our modern world, because the Old Testament was a theocracy. And some people say, yeah, but it says that we should really welcome the foreigners. Well, okay, if you want to take that, foreigners never had the same status in Israel in the theocracy that a Jew had. So do you want to have that in your culture? No, we really don't. And this one here talks about a foreigner that does not belong to your people, but has come from a distant land. Okay, we treat them with some respect, but they never have access to the temple. They never, in a sense, have full rights. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about applying some of these Old Testament verses, especially in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, but also in things like 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles to our day. But at the same time, she asked a bigger question, and that is, how do we deal with this? Because if you have individuals here that are Muslim who really believe in the American dream and maybe served in the military or serve in law enforcement, we welcome those individuals. But when we bring other people in who believe in Sharia law, have a desire ultimately to overturn the Constitution and establish a worldwide caliphate, I think everybody would agree we don't want them in. And I'm not so sure how we separate those. Any thoughts? Part of it gets back to assimilation. Maybe we need to really begin to talk about how we assimilate people into the American experience.
I think that has been one of the most controversial statements Donald Trump made in his election bid, his presidential bid, is to talk about we need to put a temporary ban on Islamic immigration to America. And it's funny because it's very easy for people to say, well, you can't discriminate based on religion, but it's not really religion. It is the kind of things, Kerby, you were just talking about. It is people coming here who do not embrace the American rule of law, the Constitution, the notion of separated, everything we have in America that makes it exceptional and extraordinary. And, one simple solution on the immigration question is just to put a halt on immigration, on all immigration for some period of time, and just to say, we're going to work on assimilating people who are here. And I think we have had, because of the system we've had in immigration, especially in the Refugee Act, we've had many people come to America and settle in kind of enclaves. So instead of having people distributed around America and in neighborhoods where they're interacting with other Americans and Christians, we have large enclaves in a small number of cities who are majority Muslim. And so they're kind of bringing their own thoughts and beliefs about the country, the world, what Allah prescribes, what Sharia should be, and they bring it to America. And there's no kind of, so we need to work on our immigration process to be sure, and I don't know what our assimilation process is, because the reason France has problems it has in large part is because it didn't do this. It continued to have large numbers of Northern African Muslims emigrate to France, settle in collected areas, in very concentrated areas, and then, trouble brewed in those areas, sure, leading to the attacks they've had.
Well, this man was from Tunisia, and another one of the places where you have these enclaves in France. Many of them are from Algeria. And so, I don't know, do we ask everybody whether or not they believe in Sharia law and kick them out if they don't? Isn't that what
well,
Newt Gingrich said?
Newt Gingrich, actually, you know what, I actually, he was on my...
I can't believe he said that, to be honest with you. But you got the facts right there. So
yeah,
for a man who's so measured, that one caught me off guard. And of course, we'll see what he has to say about it when the video comes out in the next couple hours. But
yes, he said he's going to explain what he meant. And Newt Gingrich did say that this last night on I think it was on Fox. But he's saying essentially, we can't just have people in this country who support Sharia. He's trying to talk about it as though you're having people here who are agitating for the overthrow of the government. And so, yeah, this was his statement. We should frankly test every person here who is of Muslim background. And if they believe in Sharia, they should be deported. Sharia is incompatible with Western civilization, which it is. But you can't really do that.
No.
I think that there's no possible way to actually implement that or vet that, and it's pretty outlandish. And we have to be careful what policies we put into place. And is this a testable policy? Is it going to have an accurate return? I think it's extraordinary that we haven't seen attacks like this yet in America, with as large as we are and the amount of immigration we've already had, which I think is telling that, I grew up in a school that had a 40% population of Muslim students, which is fairly high for this area. And they were all very well assimilated, and we were all very close friends, and, they identified as American. And so I don't know that the issue is necessarily for those who are assimilating. I do think it's what you're saying, when there's isolationists, when we as a culture are not reaching out to our neighbor and are not befriending our neighbor, It's easy for people to go where what's familiar and what's accepting, but further remembering that ISIS is recruiting people regardless of nationality.
Yeah, for sure. But again, there have been some that have suggested, and we're starting to see this in some school districts, where to graduate from high school, you have to pass the citizenship test that is required of a person that comes to this country. Because, when I've met Chelsey and Debbie, individuals that have gone through the whole process of naturalization, they've learned our history, they've learned our values, they have really, in a sense, been able to assimilate with American culture. Sadly, a lot of young people today go through high school, maybe even grade school, and never really learn much about the founding ideals of America. If we required everybody to at least know that, I'd feel a little bit better, because then you can see, do you agree or disagree with the values that have made America great? And I think that's a better test. As a matter of fact, Sebastian Gorkin has been saying that. Don't try to figure out Sharia or anything else, because there's different definitions of Sharia. And by definition, government can't get involved in religion, shouldn't get involved in religion. But you could ask how you stand on the values of America, and that might be a better way to do it. But back to Debbie's question, do we shut it down for a while? And if you have a leak in your house and the water's dripping, what's the first thing you do? You turn off the water, right? And it seems to me that maybe we need to think about that. But let's take one more phone call real quickly, and then we'll take some other topics in that second hour. In Texas, KCTA. Oni, thank you for calling today.
Yes, thank you. Your program's fantastic. Anyway, my husband, is a military retired of 22 years, and I got two sons in the military right now. And we were talking about all this, all this terrorism and stuff. And we believe that it's time for the United States to take action. But I also believe that we have to do it differently. We have to do it. Number one, it has to be spiritually. Number two, it has to be, the society has to take responsibility to be aware of your surroundings. Be aware of who's your neighbor. Know each other. Know what's going on. Call in suspicious activities. It's better to offend someone than to have that person go and kill, hundreds of people. And then, of course, physically we have to take action. Faith without action is dead. Jesus said, to Peter at one point, he says, buy you a sword. Now, so that means, the policemen are God's servants. They're here to protect us. And I believe with all my heart that if we all band together, this demonic, spiritual, physically, whatever, it can be conquered. We will endure. And God's word is very, very powerful. It will not come back void.
Very good. Again, you talked about spiritual. We've talked about this with Ann Graham Lotz, and of course, we'll be talking about a little of that on Monday with Jack Graham and all the prayer events and even the solemn assembly of Tony Evans. And of course, you talked about see something, say something. We need to come back to that and then get involved as well. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some more of your phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. When I find out from our roundtable what they think about the vice presidential nominee, Mike Pence, and also we know quite a bit about both the Republican platform and the Democratic platform. There is virtually no overlap between the two, so we'll talk about that and much more with you right after these important messages. Stay tuned.
From Sony Pictures Home Entertainment comes Miracles from Heaven, based on the true story about hope, family, and the power of faith. When 10-year-old Anna Beam develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are God's way of letting us know He's here.
And then a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner. Available now on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Rated PG.
The threats to our children and grandchildren today come from many places. Some originate in Washington, D.C. and impact your local schools. Others are hatched overseas. Even major corporations are embracing policies that threaten your family. We can't afford to do nothing. Join the team, Truth Team 360. Enable point of of View to examine what's happening and develop good and wise responses. Together, we can make a difference. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the top right corner. Become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, it is our weekend edition, and we're privileged to have in studio with us today Debbie Georgatos as well as Chelsey Youman. And we have links to Ladies Can We Talk, which is now called America Can We Talk, and also links to First Liberty. But I thought, in addition to some of the issues we put on the table, and by the way, if you'd like to still join on some of the topics, we've talked about, of course, religious liberty, and we've talked about the killing there on Bastille Day in France, but we were going to get a few other issues. One, of course, the vice presidential nominee, Mike Pence. Who is he, and what about that? Look at some of these platform issues. But if you'd like to join us on any topic we've covered so far, or maybe add an additional one to our weekend edition, 1-800-351-1212. Okay, what do we think about Mike Pence? A lot of people would say, well, if you picked Newt Gingrich, everybody would know who he is. Mike Pence is somebody that a lot of us do know. As a matter of fact, in one of the Values Voters Summits a couple of years ago that Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter and Tony Perkins, everybody goes to, they actually selected Mike Pence as somebody they thought should run for the presidency. He chose not to after serving 12 years in Congress and ran as governor and has been the governor until now. But any thoughts around the round table? Either one of you have any thoughts about Mike Pence?
I think it was a very good choice for a variety of reasons for Donald Trump as a to have Mike Pence as a vice president. For one thing, I think that's a great balance between just kind of, not just geographic, but personality-wise. You know, Donald Trump is this big East Coast, blustery personality. It's a good counter to that. And that's why Chris Christie would not have been a good choice in my view, because he's just a whole other East Coast, blustery guy. But I think Mike Pence on substance has a lot of great things to offer. I think that Donald Trump, because he doesn't have any political experience, is going to help him to have Governor Pence, who's been in Congress, who knows how to deal with Congress, who understands how the system works. That's going to help him a little bit. He really is coming in, Donald Trump would be, if he wins the election, coming to Washington kind of kindergarten level, learning how you deal with Congress. So I think that's a good thing about him. I think Mike Pence has been a pretty steady conservative. My one little hesitation about him is backbone is a huge issue, and it's needed more than ever today. And when Governor Pence signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana, it was a time when the LGBT community, the activism is greatly increased. It's very, very confrontational and aggressive. And he blinked. Governor Pence backed down and passed a fix which basically eviscerated. He didn't have the fight in him. And on that issue, I don't think that he lacks the spiritual Christian clarity about marriage and religion and abortion and all those issues. I think he has the Christian clarity. He didn't have the backbone. And this era, far more than when he ever ran for Congress, the left is as aggressive as it's ever been in this country. And he needs to be sure he has that backbone that he did not show in the RFRA battle.
I completely agree. I do not think Trump could have picked a more complimentary vice president. I mean, in a lot of ways, he is everything that Trump is not. But there are a couple similarities that I think are worth noting. First and foremost, they're both big business conservatives. So when you speak to the lack of a backbone in that area, I think we can attribute this, and it's something that doesn't get a lot of press about the Republican Party, is there is a dichotomy between big business conservatives who are very socially liberal because that does serve their big business interests, and, socially conservative evangelical types. And I think Pence got it wrong on that issue a year ago when he did the fix that frankly left no one happy. But besides that, he does have a history of being a little bit anti-establishment before it was popular. He in 2006, he even ran against Boehner and whipped 30 votes together, which I think is saying something, to the point that they recognized him and put him as one of the top 4 in Republican leadership with Congress. And he also, we know that he opposed the No Child Left Behind Act and any initiatives that expanded government role under George Bush, he did oppose. And so I'm hoping that he and Trump will not let their big business constituents get the better of them, and that they will stand strong on these socially conservative.
Let's talk about Backbone for a minute. I'll give him at least some credit for the fact that not only did he stand against the president on No Child Left Behind, but also he was one of the first supporters of Paul Ryan's fiscal bills, which were ones that were going to address some of the issues of Social Security. And he basically almost shut down the government over wanting to defund Planned Parenthood when he was in Congress. So he has demonstrated that on a number of occasions. But back to the issue of business, his state has the second lowest corporate income tax in the nation, and certainly we have seen tremendous growth in the Hoosier economy, so that might be useful on all the issues that we care about, whether it's life and marriage and religious liberty. Seems to understand all of those. One other I might just mention, I think it will help Donald Trump with fundraising, and that is the individual that serves as his chief of staff is Mark Short, who served originally for the Koch brothers. And so some of that big business money, because again, most of them are kind of more libertarian, might work. Again, when asked to describe himself, Mike Pence said he's a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order, which I thought was kind of nice. So those are a couple of issues. I see some of you know Mike Pence, especially I'd love to hear from some of you in Indiana, so you can add more to that. There are other possibilities that Donald Trump could have picked. What about Newt Gingrich? Was that something that maybe he wants to put Newt Gingrich in another position in his administration? Because it certainly seems to me that Newt Gingrich and Donald Trump seem to be tied at the hip right now.
They certainly did, and it seemed like Newt Gingrich almost in the last several months was kind of applying for the VP job. He was out there really advocating pretty strongly for Donald Trump, and I do think that he's another voice that could help Donald Trump in Washington connect with Congress, connect with players and institutions. So I think Donald Trump, if he wins an election, he will find a place for Newt Gingrich somewhere in his administration. And I think he'll find a place for Chris Christie, Governor Christie. I don't know whether it would be Attorney General or something like that, but I think that Chris Christie's hung in there with him. So a lot of these people can be somewhere involved in the administration. But Newt Gingrich would have been great, I think.
That brings me, before we take our first phone call here, to some have suggested the possibility that not only would Donald Trump, of course, name his VP, which you have to do, but also name his cabinet. Now, in the past, people don't do that. But if you already knew that, say, I don't know, let's take Ben Carson is going to be Secretary of Health and Human Services or Surgeon General, and you know that maybe, I don't know, Chris Christie is the Attorney General, or maybe Trey Gowdy or somebody like that, would that help him in terms of possible votes?
Absolutely. I think Trump is aware now more than ever how much he needs to unite the Republican Party and get the evangelicals on board. And he's frankly an unknown factor in a lot of ways on almost every policy. And so by partnering with someone who has a clear history, a clear voting history with Congress and relationships there with Paul Ryan, I think it behooves him to also show his cards to his party to get them on board. He released his 11 Supreme Court justice nominee potential list, and I think the more he shows the public that he's serious, he's listening to conservative advisors, the more he'll be taken seriously at the polls. We're
going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. Maybe you have some thoughts about Mike Pence. We'll get into also with some of the platforms. We have a pretty good idea what the Republican platform and the Democratic platform are going to look like, and of course, we've talked about some of these police shooting statistics, and I know, Debbie, you're going to have Heather McDonald on your program. We've had her on this one, so we'll talk about some of that. So a lot more to cover, and we will take those calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Is America great? Was America great? It looks like we'll be having a debate about those questions in the next few months. During the 4th of July weekend, many on the left used America was never great hashtag on social media. While most of us were celebrating this nation's founding, liberals and progressives were making long lists of America's sins. Of course, these critics have every right to do so. That's what the First Amendment is all about. And it is worth mentioning that many of the other countries in the world do not grant its citizens the privilege of doing so. Perhaps they should be a little more grateful that they could actually fill social media with every possible criticism of this country and not have to pay any consequences. The reason for this hashtag is fairly obvious. Donald Trump wants to make America great again. And there are many others who not only believe America was great in the past, but great today. Talk show host Michael Medved starts every program and ends every program with a statement that this is the greatest nation on God's green earth. Given the decline in America, people sometimes ask him if he thinks it is still the greatest nation. He always responds by asking them, can you think of a better nation? Fortune magazine used 75 criteria to look at a country's progress in areas such as entrepreneurship, cultural influence, business-friendly practices, and economic progress. They concluded that Germany was the best country, with the United States coming in fourth. The United States was first in power, but lower in a few other categories. Even if you accept the rating criteria used by Fortune, you can still say that America is one of the greatest countries in the world. Is America great? Was America ever great? There are lots of people who don't believe that it was. So let's have a debate about America's greatness that involves more than a hashtag of 140 characters. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Available now. Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Rated PG. Miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgatos as well as Chelsey Youman. And we'll go to Charles in South Carolina, KJRT. Charles, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome. I hope I can get a couple minutes.
You got it.
We have seen a couple of candidates the last couple of cycles, McCain and Romney. Yeah, and I'm not going to get into whether it was intentional or not, but we saw them not pull out all the stops and do and say everything they needed in order to win. It appeared as though they were just running interference for the Democrat opponent. And again, I'm not going to say they did that on purpose. You know, maybe they had some reason. But I think this is what we're seeing right now with Trump choosing Pence. I don't see where Pence gives him anything. He's not a minority. Boy, could Trump use a minority to blow away these accusations against him. He will even there are some minorities that he could have picked that have been really good, like Dr. Carson. Ann Coulter in lamenting. Now, she's been 100% behind Trump the whole time, but in lamenting this pick, mentioned David Clark, who's somebody that I would love to see on the ticket. And as far as Pence opposing Common Core, you see a reposting today in a mail out by what's her name, Michelle Malkin, of a 2014 article that she posted that really blew that out of the way. That was a complete scam. He did not oppose it. He just repackaged it. And as far as religious freedom, that's really serious. Trump is terrible on that issue. He hasn't stood up for anybody in that regard. And you see the guy that did a complete belly up on it being vice president. I don't see any way that a Christian that doesn't want to work a gay wedding is going to keep his freedom, his house, his life savings, his job, his business, because they've been losing all of these things. And I don't see any improvement in that area. What is Pence going to do? A complete 180 and then convince Trump? I think it's a terrible pick, and I think not just Malkin, but Ann Coulter, who's been Trump's biggest supporter, agree.
Okay. Well, Charles, I think you very articulately kind of put forward some of the other concerns that will surface. It's a better pick than we might have ended up with, but again, I think of others that might have worked out. So, Charles, thank you so much for giving us some of those facts and figures. We'll dig it out on this whole issue of Common Core. We've had Michelle Malkin on, so we'll get her on again. Maybe she can help us understand some of those issues. Let's go to Georgia on the Good News Network. Kenny, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Good afternoon, Kerby. Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to speak about our Supreme Court justices and how they are placed into their offices. Obviously, we know they're appointed. And it's a huge concern. You, as a Christian, you turn on the news, and it seems like every time we turn around, they're passing laws that pretty much slap our morals in the face. And my question is, as American people, how do we change this system? How do we go about changing the system so that we are able to elect by a majority vote our Supreme Court justices? People with so much power and say over our day-to-day lives need to be elected by the people.
Well, one idea that's been suggested with this idea of an Article 5 constitutional convention is to actually allow Supreme Court justices to be appointed by state legislatures. You know, that would kind of go back to something that we haven't done in a long time. But I'll get back to that in just a minute. But I'd love to get your roundtable conversation about this, because Donald Trump has done something else. He's not only told us who his vice presidential nominee is days before most do, he's also given us a list, Chelsey, of 11 individuals that he thinks would be the group from which he would pick. Now he's going to add to that. And Kelly and I went through that list, and we'd say at least 9 out of those 11 we think are really good, and the other 2 are okay. That's pretty unusual that you've ever had a candidate for the presidency tell you ahead of time who he or she would actually put on the Supreme Court.
Yes, I think if you are going to have one issue you're voting on, one thing you would vote for Trump for, it is because he's got 4 years to appoint hundreds of federal judges to the bench, and that cannot be overstated enough. If he gets 8 years, we're looking at upwards of 500 federal judges. That's enough to change up the entire makeup of the future of our constitutional law, frankly. So if you are very concerned about your constitutional rights, which, you know, at First Liberty, we represent religious liberty groups all the time on this issue, we have an eye towards who our president and an interest in who our president is going to appoint, not just the potential 3 Supreme Court seats he might be having, but you know, these federal judges, they make or break our rights in the next 4 to 8 years, and that cannot be overstated enough.
I couldn't agree more. You know, I think that a lot of people, I use the word incomprehensible about Donald Trump's policies, and I do kind of feel that way. But I think we know with certainty that if you were to elect a Democrat, Hillary Clinton, the presumptive nominee, you would have in the same thing Chelsey was mentioning a moment ago, you would have all those seats in the federal district courts, the trial courts, the appellate courts, which are the circuit courts, or the Supreme Court. They would all be filled with liberal justices who have very little respect for the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, the whole constitutional structure. So it would be a very different America after 4 or even worse, 8 years of Hillary. So it's a reason all by itself to vote on the conservative side, which is really kind of the pro-Christian side, the pro, you know, the pro-constitutional side of our the political life in America now.
I was struck by the fact, and I wasn't at the meeting, but Kelly Shackelford and others were, where he said he would appoint pro-life justices. Now, I'm sitting here saying, okay, I've been around a long time. I can't remember Ronald Reagan saying pro-life justices. I can't imagine ever hearing George Herbert Walker Bush or George W. Bush saying pro-life justices. They would say like strict constructionalists or constitutionalists. Donald Trump said pro-life justices. That's pretty amazing. I don't think I've ever heard that.
His list is very sound and should be very reassuring to conservatives everywhere that he has clearly surrounded himself with knowledgeable advisors. He's even more surprising in some ways, taking their advice and publishing this list ahead of time.
Yes.
I think it's a great sign. I think that he's surrounded himself with people who are knowledgeable. And as he mentioned, the Heritage Foundation, I think you said, and Federalist Society would be vetting some of these judges and helping him make those decisions.
Sure.
And you could not have any more conservative, constitutionally minded group of people choosing essentially what your rights are going to be for the foreseeable future.
Again, Kenny was asking about direct election of justices. That's not going to happen, but it was interesting. I did allude to it. Let me just mention, especially for Kenny or anybody else who would like to read about this, that, of course, we've had Michael Ferris on this program before, and he and Mark Levin and another have called for what you call an Article 5 state constitution, basically constitutional convention. There are two ways to amend the Constitution. One, of course, is 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the state legislatures, and that's how we get our amendments. But there's another way to have actually a constitutional convention. It's real controversial and all the rest. But nevertheless, one of the things he's proposed is that this would take the power away from justices that would be appointed for life. He's proposed, for example, some kind of amendment that would have a limit to your service. Another one he's proposed is that each particular state would be able to appoint a Supreme Court justice. And the model he uses is, if you look at the European Court of Human Rights, that's what it happens right now. Every one of those nations can appoint a justice. Well, that puts the power back on the states, if you will, and that could eventually be expanded so that you could have 50 justices, or else you just have a rotation over a period of time. But I don't think it's ever going to happen. But back to Kenny's question, it's interesting because a lot of people feel like we need to do something because the federal judiciary is completely out of control.
One other proposal I saw is a similar. I do love the idea of an Article 5 convention. I think that we're getting close to needing it. But one other suggestion I saw was to continue the current process of selecting Supreme Court justices, but have a recall procedure. Whether it's Congress can vote for recall, if 2/3 of the House and the Senate vote to recall a justice, it keeps the rogue justice idea in play or under wraps, under control.
Yeah. If nothing else, one question I'd love to put on the table: should Ruth Bader Ginsburg step down?
Yes.
I would vote for that.
I think Donald Trump would as well. And so it really shows you the stakes. You already have one vacant seat. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and some others are so old, and I'll give you the ages when we come back in just a minute, because it is striking how especially the liberal members of the court are old enough, or the swing state, swing vote of Kennedy, are old enough that it's probably true that they will step down. So when we say that the next president will really determine the outlook of the court, that's pretty safe, isn't it?
It is.
Yes.
Let's take a break then, and when we come back, we are going to give a few more of you a chance to join our conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Talked about Mike Pence. I want to talk a little bit about the platform. We know quite a bit about the Republican platform. New York Times the other day called it a far-right platform, but I don't know that it's really much difference from the 2012 platform. But when you look at the 2016 Democratic platform, even William Galston, who served with Bill Clinton in his administration, says that the Democratic platform has taken a sharp left turn. All those Bernie Sanders delegates have really yanked it to the left, and we'll talk more about that right after this.
Imagine it's January 2021. The president elected in 2016 has served 4 years. Tell me, what does the Supreme Court look like with maybe 2, 3, even 4 justices named by this next resident of the Oval Office? Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? Depending on the results in November, 4 years from now will look very different, and together we can influence those outcomes. We need each other. Together we are the Truth Team, and together we can honor Christ as we exercise our stewardship as believers and citizens. One way to make a difference is to visit pointofview.net and support the Truth Team. Pointofview.net. or give when you call 1-800-347-5151. The nation is so divided. We must be united. pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Or just a minute, I want to go around the round table and find out a little bit more about the organizations that are represented here, because it's just a great opportunity for you to find the links that we have here as well. And first of all, Debbie Georgatos with us. America Can We Talk is now the name of the radio program. And, you know, Mike Pence started out as a talk show host. I don't know if you know that. He was with a think tank. He was with a think tank for a number of years, and we had Dr. Merrill Matthews in here a couple of days ago, and they both got to meet each other 25 years ago when he was involved, that is Dr. Matthews, in a Texas think tank. And, of course, Pence was involved in the Indiana think tank, then was a talk show host, and then a TV host, and then eventually a member of Congress and a governor. So, you know, if
and he's a lawyer. And he's a lawyer.
So I guess your next step is what, governor, and then vice P. Anyway, talk about your talk show for just a minute, because I want people to be able to listen to it. People in the Dallas area can listen to it on radio, but anybody else can listen to it online, can't they?
I really appreciate that. The show has been called Ladies Can We Talk, and right now the website is still ladiescanwetalk.org, and at the top left there is a listen live button. So the show is on Sunday nights 6 to 8 p.m. in Central Time in Texas, and so that shows on 6:60 a.m. But if you are not in Texas, you can listen to it by going to Ladies Can We Talk and click on Listen Live. We are in the process of transitioning to the new website, which is pretty much the same, except going to be called America Can We Talk, and we changed the name to really send a signal that the show is for everyone, men and women, and we talk about all the issues facing America.
And again, if you click on your picture, it takes you there, and you can see you actually doing the talk show, newest talking points, latest videos, statements on today's issues. And I might just mention, you do a lot of interviews for Fox Radio, don't you, as well?
Yes, I'm a Fox News Radio national political analyst, and so I'm on a lot with them and talking about all sorts of issues that we're talking about here today.
Again, if you go to Chelsea's website, First Liberty, there's a place where you can get updates and donate to the organization. Of course, I follow you also on Facebook, find out more about what's going on in your life as well, as you're traveling all over the place. Cassie and you are at one place, and then Washington, D.C. and Iowa. But again, talk about what's available there at firstliberty.org.
Sure. We are the biggest legal organization in America dedicated to defending religious liberties. So we defend individuals, organizations, churches, you name it, whose rights are being infringed by the government. And if you go to our website, you can read more about our cases and then what you can do to help defend religious liberty in America as well.
So again, if you know of somebody that was told that they couldn't have a Bible on their desk when they were a student, or you hear that somebody was not allowed to mention God in a speech, they could call First Liberty and find out if you could send a demand letter or something like that.
That's right. We've represented students, teachers, military members, believe it or not, who weren't allowed to put up even a scripture in their offices. And we also operate with churches and other religious entities. So,
yeah, those of you in the military, that's another thing that Michael Berry's really involved with right now. So just focus on that as well. While we're talking about the court, I did want to give you those numbers. I mentioned this in my July 7th commentary, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg is already 83 years of age. And I think she's about ready to step down. But if not, we mentioned two other individuals. Anthony Kennedy will turn 80 this summer, and Justice Stephen Breyer will turn 78 this summer. Now, again, you two are court watchers. What happens if Hillary Clinton is able to replace three of those four, maybe even four, but certainly three individuals? And what happens if Donald Trump is able to replace those three individuals?
I'm going to give a short answer because this is Chelsea's kind of lifeblood and the job she does with First Liberty. But the short answer is, even though all of you listening may think that the law should simply be like a mathematical equation, you know, it's 4 + 4, the answer has to be 8. The law says this, the judges will find X. But really, people's view of the law, their interpretation of law is shaped by their political viewpoints, by their respect for the Constitution, by their understanding of the nature of the Constitution as a founding document, and really by their, it's sad to say, but we were talking on the break about how the 4 liberal justices on the Supreme Court never fail to vote in the most liberal way possible in every case that comes before the court. So people's perspective is, justices' perspectives shape the cases and how they vote, how they decide, what they write in their opinions. So it just couldn't matter more.
Yes, we often joke in our office internally that sometimes judge opinions end up being a conclusion in search of a reason, a legal reasoning. Wow. And, you know, Scalia, he used to say that if you truly are a constitutional judge and a nonpartisan judge, then there should be decisions you make that you personally disagree with. And Over the break, you mentioned that consistently we've seen all 4 judges of the court who tend to have liberal leniencies. There's no outliers there. They always vote together as a pack. Kennedy is traditionally the swing vote justice, and as we know, Scalia was one of the more conservative originalist justices on the court. So whoever the next nominee will be has the potential of completely changing the composition of the court for even the next 50 years. And the precedents set during that time are enough to even change our constitutional rights.
On the subject of constitutional rights, for our listeners, you may think these are written in the Constitution so that naturally any justice of the Supreme Court would respect them and assume that the standard is we're going to honor them. But really, there are many on the American left are pushing against, for example, the Second Amendment, the idea that you have a right that the Second Amendment means what it says. You have a right to keep and bear arms. But there is much pressure in Washington to push away from that, to take away guns from private citizens. That's one area where the country could change drastically. And another one we talk about so frequently on this show has to do with religious liberty, and whether you're a pastor and you do not choose to have in your church same-sex weddings. It sounds crazy, and you think, well, they're never going to tell a pastor whether you have to conduct same-sex weddings. Yes, they would. Yes, they would. I mean, the idea that you will lose what your right as a church, as a pastor, as an individual believing Christian to live your life in accordance with your understanding of the scriptures, yes, that could happen based on what the Supreme Court did.
Wow.
And to put it in perspective, in the last 50 years, the types of rights we've gotten have included the rights for students to pray in school and to read their Bible in school. We know that Hobby Lobby protected, for-profit institutions who have religious leaders to continue to operate in accordance with their religious beliefs. There has even been, in a unanimous decision, Hosanna Tabor in 2011 was the first time the Supreme Court held that religious institutions can hire and fire and make those determinations based on their religious beliefs. So a lot of the rights and protections that we have even come about in the last 50 years.
Yeah, we go back to a couple of other cases, Mergen's case, as well as a few of the others, but there aren't many. So again, this is why, in some respects, religious liberty hangs in the balance based upon these justices, which is one of the calls that we want to take right now. We'll go to Texas, KCTA. Susan, I think you want to add to our conversation about the Supreme Court, so you have the floor.
Yes, I had a question about the balance of powers between the 3 branches. If initially the House and the Senate wrote constitutional bills, it seems like it wouldn't throw all of it on the decisions of the Supreme Court. They would just already be constitutional and not create the problems. I'm thinking that you can lean too far to depending on the Supreme Court. If our Congress can't produce constitutional bills. They have a judiciary. They're most of them attorneys. I don't know why they can't manage to write a constitutional bill that doesn't have to be challenged.
Right. And again, you would think that's kind of what the framers intended, but there are some that depend upon the Supreme Court, because I will make the case, Chelsey, you can agree or disagree, but I think that some of the liberals depend on the court to do things that they know they could never pass in the legislature. If you put it for an up or down vote on whether or not you could have prayer in the schools, whether or not an individual could actually say God in a valedictorian address, whether or not we could have same-sex marriage, I'm not sure some of these and many other topics would ever be implemented if it weren't for the fact that the Supreme Court is really, in many cases, instituting a liberal agenda.
That's right. And we do think precedent is on our side at First Liberty Institute. We win over 90% of our cases. I think you mentioned that earlier in the show. Mm-hmm. And that's because the judges are, or traditionally have, really strongly protected your First Amendment rights. And I think that the risk that could change is something we all need to pay attention to, because as the caller mentioned, these institutions, the president elects and appoints the judges who interpret the laws that Congress passes. I mean, they're all very interrelated. So your vote really does matter.
Yeah. But is it a problem that we're just not passing laws that are constitutional and then the court has to strike them down? What about this, Debbie?
I don't think Congress has passed overtly, clearly unconstitutional laws. I mean, maybe in the early days, but in this era, legislation is complex. It has a lot of work goes into by many, many committees. There's large pieces of legislation. And I don't think, you're right. Our caller, Susan, is right that there are many lawyers in Congress and lawyers on the committees that review the law. So it isn't like they haven't thought about it. But the Supreme Court and the other appellate or the district courts and other appellate courts can reach decisions that because they have a different political perspective. And so they see something that to many lawyers seems constitutional, and that court says it's not. It doesn't mean that the law was bad to start with. It can mean that the courts have decided this doesn't fit with our agenda. We're going to find something wrong with it.
I think they should have declared a few more unconstitutional. Dodd-Frank, Obamacare. We've got a long list. We'll be right back.
The federal government and state and local governments across the nation have been busy lately, forcing upon businesses, schools, and public entities their version of non-discrimination, which includes affirmation of all sexual orientations and anyone's chosen gender identity. Amidst all the controversy about these sexual orientation and gender identity bathroom laws, we have taken one thing for granted. Churches are exempt from these laws and requirements and their associated legal penalties. But an unprecedented mandate surfaced in the state of Iowa, revealing that church exemption from these laws is not a given. The state's Civil Rights Commission published a brochure entitled Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, a Public Accommodations Provider's Guide to Iowa Law. The guide states that churches are considered places of public accommodation, so they would generally not be exempt. The stated policy extended problematic bathroom policies to churches. And worse, according to this brochure, the state was claiming some authority over what a church teaches, its doctrine, what is preached from the pulpit regarding sexuality. These are the Iowa Civil Rights Commission's stated requirements for public accommodations. Patrons and congregants must be allowed to use living facilities, locker rooms, and restrooms based on gender identity rather than sex assigned at birth. Pronouns used in addressing people must correspond to their gender identity. In addition, the definition of harassment is expanded. Speech that conveys hostility or causes someone to feel unwelcome is forbidden. This could be interpreted as restricting a church's ability to teach its religious beliefs about sexuality. Is such a blatant violation of the First Amendment really the state's intent? That question is actually answered in the brochure. There's a section titled, Does this law apply to churches? The answer? Sometimes. If a church's service, outreach, or activity is, quote, not related to a bona fide religious purpose, it would have to comply. Who decides whether an activity is religious enough? The state. Cornerstone World Outreach, a non-denominational Sioux City church, recognized that the church was in violation and with its mission of outreach to the public would never be able to comply. First Liberty Institute, representing Cornerstone, sent a demand letter to the Iowa Civil Rights Commission asking that it retract this mandate. The commission responded by revising the document and clarifying that churches are exempt, that these requirements existed in the heartland of America, that the state of Iowa officially claimed the power to regulate church facilities and what they can teach about human sexuality, ought to send chills up the spines of pastors nationwide. First, they came for the florists and bakers who declined to participate in same-sex marriages. Then they came for other businesses attempting to operate within the owner's faith principles. Then they came for the schools. Now we must be very vigilant because they are coming for the churches. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me put something on the table that Susan's question brought up, and that is, yes, the legislature passes some laws, and yes, the Supreme Court cancels some of them, but a lot of what is happening in the government today has to do with regulations. There was a study done recently, and it found that Congress enacted 138 public laws. So 138 public laws. But federal agencies finalized 2,926 rules. So that's like a 20-to-1 ratio. 2,926 to 138. that shows you what's happening. And those rules were part of 61 different major regulations. So, Chelsey, in a sense, the government is running on autopilot. It's bureaucrats that we don't know at the EPA, at the FCC, certainly at the IRS, and all sorts of places that are redefining words and redefining regulations and writing new rules and regulations. And there doesn't seem to be any congressional oversight.
That's right. Meet your fourth branch of government, and that is thousands and thousands of unelected officials, bureaucrats who write these memorandums, like the Iowa Commission on Civil Rights that we discussed earlier in the show, who drafted a brochure interpreting the law that stood and interpreted it. I don't know if they're not attorneys, but they interpreted it in an unconstitutional manner, and then they're the ones charged with enforcing the law in an unconstitutional manner.
The subject of the proliferation of federal regulations has been really being discussed in Congress in Washington for a decade or 2 decades. It's just been a major proliferation in the last 10 or 20 years. And part of what happens, you use the word unaccountable. Someone said unaccountable. It really is true that if your congressman stood and passed a law or supported a law and you didn't like it, you would, contact your congressman. If you got really upset about it, you might support someone else to run against him or her. But when agencies do it, it's faceless. And these are part, to the caller's point a moment ago, this is part of what the Supreme Court does find unconstitutional. It finds occasionally that regulations are not justified by the legislation that was in the Congress passed a law and the agency wrote regulation on that. Find the regulation was not justified by. In fact, that was what the Obamacare thing, the first Obamacare, one of the early decisions should have been, was when HHS expanded a lot of the power under Obamacare, and the Supreme Court let them do it. What happened?
Let's take a phone call on Mike Pence, and some of you were asking questions about that. I think Jill from Indiana wants to help us understand a little bit more about Governor Pence. He's your governor. What have you learned?
I remember when the Common Core was going on and we had meetings, and the superintendent of public instruction, Glenda Ritz, she didn't really listen they had the meetings, and when you listen to them, the parents explained the problems with it. But anyway, Mr. Pence did try to bring in somebody to help us, but it does look like we got something that was renamed. What is still Common Core, but he did try to help us, but he was fighting the superintendent of public instruction. And then the other thing that I heard, I do remember also that when the bailout thing was going on, he wrote a letter to his other Congress people asking them to not bail the banks out.
Yeah, I remember that.
I think he's done some good things. I think he's not perfect, but I do think that, like I said, he did try to help keep Common Core out of Indiana, but because of the fight with the superintendent of public instruction, he wasn't completely successful.
Sure.
But I appreciate him trying. So anyway, that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Well, appreciate that. And we'll probably do a program on Common Core again. We've had Michelle Malkin and all sorts of other experts on in that regard. But with just a few minutes left, I thought we'd just tell you that as you watch the Republican convention next week, and I hope that you will, if not, you can listen to us talk about it here on Point of View. We first of all have a few things you might mention, and that is there has been, interestingly enough, in this platform, which is why the New York Times called it a far-right platform, a little bit more of a strong immigration policy. They also have shown their opposition to the forced transgender bathroom directive. And so that, of course, makes it, if you will, controversial. I don't think it's at all. Support for a strong national defense. And also another reason why sometimes they call it far right is the America First policy when it relates to trade agreements. And here's where you see a striking difference, because Hillary Clinton says she's against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something we talked about earlier in the week, but really she's for it. And it's very obvious that Donald Trump is against it. And this is one of the things I want to go around the roundtable, because if you look at the Republican platform and the Democratic platform that are coming out now for 2016, there's no overlap. Remember when you were kids, they had the Venn diagrams and things were over? Well, back in 1960, I think they were almost overlapping completely. But by 1972, with George McGovern being the candidate, in a sense, it's sort of locked into place in the Democratic Party that there's no place for you to be pro-life. And the last pro-life person that even thought about running for the presidency in the Democratic Democratic Party was Governor Casey. But, it's pro-life. It's really anti-military, kind of pro-strong defense, high taxes. And by 1980 with Ronald Reagan, that sort of became the conservative idea. Now, in the Republican Party, it's a lot more of a big tent. But if nothing else, we're going to post both the Republican platform and the Democratic platform, and you will be struck by the fact that on almost no issue is there any agreement. And in a sense, Debbie, that kind of illustrates the polarization we see right now in Congress, doesn't it?
It really does. And the other thing I'd suggest to our listeners, I think there are many voters in America who vote the way their parents did and their grandparents did, and they just say, wow, we're proudly Democrat. In fact, that's what Governor Pence grew up in, a family where they were Irish Catholic Democrats. And he realized as he became an adult and paid attention to politics more, that the Democrat Party didn't stand for what he believed in. So I really urge listeners, if you have especially long-term Democrat family voting in your family's history, actually read the platform, because the Democrat Party is, in my view, way far left of core basic Americanism. You said that someone was labeling the GOP platform as extreme, and I haven't read it, but I'm going to suggest the Democrat platform is going to be the one so far extreme, radical left, you'd be shocked.
Yeah, William Galston in the Wall Street Journal just the other day, and he was in the Clinton administration, said that the party that Hillary Clinton will lead into battle this fall is not Bill Clinton's Democratic Party, because there are no moderates in the Democratic Party anymore.
Wow,
a lot of them have
that's
lost.
A big thing for him to say.
And he's talking about all the things that have been added to this platform in 2016 that were not in the 2012, and I think that's an illustration in large part of the influence of Bernie Sanders.
Yes, it's definitely a polarized political climate, and we've seen that amping up in the most recent years, but it's more evident now than ever. I believe that some of their new platforms even include expanding profit sharing for workers' earnings, lots of increased tax initiatives, big government, obviously.
$15 an hour, minimum wage.
Yes,
where did that come from?
Yes, I think that it's just important to note. They don't recognize the Second Amendment anymore on the platform whatsoever, and I don't know if they recognize any constitutional rights in the platform.
And the old platform used to say that we want to make abortion safe, legal and rare. And now they've taken all that out, because Planned Parenthood and selling baby parts and all of that. So, I mean, it is as different as you can possibly imagine. So it will be interesting to watch. So I hope everybody will take the time to watch the convention and hear the speakers over the next couple of weeks. And both of you, I want to thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. It's great fun, always.
Been fun.
America, Can We Talk, and First Liberty. And we have both of the links on the website. So take the time to learn from both of these women that are doing an outstanding job, and we're just privileged to have them with us. Let me just mention that Penna Dexter's commentary, which will show up in your inbox tomorrow, is already on our website right now about the Iowa churches. Another victory. We need to hear more of those. Have a great weekend. On Monday, we're going to have, as I mentioned, Jack Graham. On Thursday in studio, we're going to have Dinesh D'Souza. It's going to be a great week, as well as a Republican convention. So I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila. We'll see you back here on Monday.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dice of First Liberty is representing Dr. Walsh in his effort to correct this apparent injustice. And Jeremy Dice became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking the truth in love. Click on Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit. Please do it today. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.